before I introduce Sabine, who can introduce me or whatever, that we can see for our Substack viewers on the webinar questions, and we will be answering some of those questions. I understand there's a chat going on YouTube, but we can't see that as well. So, or I can't at the same time. So if you, for this and future events like this, if you want to ask questions, you can join the Substack, join our Substack, subscribe to the Foundation Substack site. And then you, like the lucky people who are participating now on our Substack site, can then ask questions. That's all I'm going to say, I think, as from the point of view of logistics. And now I want to welcome and thank Sabine Hossenfelder, my friend and colleague, who is way over there in Germany, and happily without road construction it was supposed to be today. And I'll turn it over to her. Hi, Sabine.
Hi, Lawrence. Good to see you. Good to see you again, I should say.
Yes.
Yet another book. Yeah, so I guess my task today is to lead everyone through the discussion of your new book, The Edge of Knowledge, Unsolved Mysteries of the Cosmos, which just appeared 2 weeks ago, 1 week ago?
About 2 weeks ago, yeah.
Two
And in
weeks
England,
ago.
just so you know, in England it's the known unknowns. It's they got two different titles. The English version has a different title. And I'll tell you right now why. The known unknowns is a quote from Donald Rumsfeld, and my American publisher did not want to have a Donald Rumsfeld quote on the cover. So
That was the original title, wasn't it?
that
I
was the
think the
original
version
title.
yeah.
I must admit, I still like the known unknowns. So the edge of knowledge has been growing on me. So anyway.
Yeah, I think it's a little more descriptive, to be honest. So
Yeah.
I quite like it. So I looked up your book on Amazon like 2 hours ago, and I saw it has a flawless 5-star rating. So I'm so jealous. I always get some people hate on me for telling them
Yeah,
things that I didn't want to hear.
that'll come. I think the fact, frankly, to be honest, and I'll be brutally honest because I'm always honest with you. I think it's got the 5-star rating because it's less widely read than your book right now.
Yet, well, it's only been 2 weeks, so you know.
Yeah, there's time. There's lots of time for haters.
There's time for people to downrate the book.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm afraid I don't have a book to show. I only have a PDF version. So unless you can see, the data in the wireless floating around, I can't hold it into the camera. Yeah, but it's a physical thing. You can go and buy it. Read it in the garden and stuff. Yeah. So I was super excited to see the book because when I was a teenager, it was exactly the kind of thing that I was looking for. I wanted to know, like, how much do we understand about the laws of nature, and where's the edge of knowledge, where it ends, and then what's the next thing to do? So, and then I remembered I'd just written a book about the same thing. So I was a little worried, that it would be basically the same ground. But after having read the book, I think there isn't all that much of an overlap. It's like the general theme is the same, of course. It's about physics and the big questions of life and so on. But I think you stay more on the side of explaining how we came to know what we know, and then what are the next steps, what are people working on, what's the research, and so on. Whereas I think I stay more on the side of speculation, things that we don't know.
Yeah, I remember when your book, your book came out. In fact, as some people know, we reversed this. I did an interview of Sabine when her book came out, and I remember thinking, "Oh my goodness!" I remember when I contacted you, let you know about the book, and you told me about yours. I thought, "Oh my goodness!" And then when I read yours, which I enjoyed tremendously, there almost could have been, we almost could have prepared it together because they're almost complementary. It's really kind of nice.
Yeah, luckily. So for those of you who haven't had a look at the book, it's divided into 5 parts on time, space, matter, life, and consciousness. So it certainly doesn't lack ambition. So I guess the obvious question to start with is, why did you write the book?
Okay, well, I partly wrote the book for the same reason that you just mentioned. I too, when I was a teenager, wanted to know just that. And at the end of the book, I relate a story that it was actually at a science. I was at some summer science program when I was in high school, and the teacher saw that I was maybe a little bored, and gave me Richard Feynman's book, The Character of Physical Law, and to read. And it was the first time. It really was the first time that it was clear to me that the questions hadn't all been answered. And obviously I've been enamored by science. I read a book about Galileo when I was 11, and that made a big difference. And I read a lot of books, and it was great to know what was happening. But it was really clear that there were all these things. I remember reading about antiparticles, and that was the first time that I thought, hey, there's something left to do. And like you, I'm sure I took that as an invitation. It's hey, there's something left to discover. Maybe I can get involved. And so that was partly it. The other reason was, well, I've written, as you know, a lot of books, and the Universe of Nothing book was about one huge question, and the Greatest Story Ever Told was about what I think is the greatest story ever told, although we may disagree, but the development of the Standard Model. And I thought, I want, and this may be the last science book I write, in fact, but I wanted to address the open questions, because not only are they fascinating, and they would give me a hook to be able to explain to people what we actually do know, because one needs a hook, I think, to try and interest people in science, because there's a big impedance barrier that people are afraid of it. So if you can ask the kind of questions they're asking, it seems less terrifying. But that's the other neat thing, is that I realize that the questions at the forefront of science are really almost the same questions that everyone asks themselves anyway, every day. The outstanding open questions are the questions we all have. How did the universe begin? Was there a time before the Big Bang? How did life begin? Are we alone in the universe? All of those things, for the most part. And I thought it was a nice way to match. And it was also a challenge. That's the other reason, because I knew I'd want to go beyond physics, because I thought, there are really important, outstanding questions that are beyond physics. And it's always a way for me to learn something. Otherwise, I write the same book over and over again. And to be honest, now it occurred to me, the other reason is that my British publisher contacted me and said, hey, why don't you write a book called The Known Unknowns? And originally, it was supposed to be like 25 questions about the universe. And then I decided that was, like you, probably, I don't know if it's the same for you, but when I write a book, it's usually ends up being very different than my proposal, or at least it takes me a while to figure out how I want to package it. Most of the time takes like the first chapter, because then I know where I'm going. And it was then that I decided I really wanted, that there are 5 major themes that really encompass what people are interested in, and that's the way I wanted to do it. So that's a long answer to your question.
So do you think it's partly something to do with our school education that we both ended up with this desire to know what we don't know? Because at least for me, it was in school, the teacher made it look like we've sorted it all out. So here's physics, this is how it works. And that's basically the end of the story. And even the stuff that, at least my teachers presented as new was like special relativity, like already 100 years old, right? And quantum mechanics was like the edge of knowledge. And I'm wondering what you think about this.
Well, that's interesting. Were they good teachers? Because I was lucky. I did have a bunch of good teachers, although my physics teacher was not a good teacher, but he appreciated that I knew he wasn't a good teacher. It is true that that's a big problem, right? And by the time stuff gets to high school, it's 50 or 60 years old at best. I think it was because of outside reading for me, and it was more than school that I got sort of intrigued. But the one thing that was really important for me, and maybe it wasn't for you, and I suspect you're maybe more self-driven, I don't know, is that I got encouraged. They all encouraged my excitement and enthusiasm. And even when I was being a pain in the ass in class, which happened, it's hard to believe, but I was. And so I think that was important for me too. And I don't know if your teachers support you, especially since, you're a woman, you were a woman, you were a girl. And I don't know if maybe in Germany that made no difference. I know that some people have argued 20 or 30 years ago that might have made a difference in Canada or the US.
You know, yeah. So there weren't many girls in the physics class. We did have a lot of boys who were like a pain in the ass. So I know what you're talking about. But yeah, so I actually think that it has changed a lot since I was in school. Exactly because we now have many more books, which at the time it was like really hard to come by something that wasn't too technical, but also not too stupid. And so I really appreciate books like this. I think we can't have sufficiently many of them, basically.
Did you read I read Einstein's books when I was younger, his popular books in English. Did you read them in German?
Yeah.
No.
It was like one of those things that you could reliably find in the library.
Yeah, okay, exactly.
Yeah, Einstein, interestingly enough, he was actually a pretty good writer. So it was actually, even without having a PhD in physics, you could kind of figure out what he was going on about.
Yeah. Did his book with Infeld was the Einstein Infeld, which I don't know if it was first in German, maybe it was, but that was a big book for me. Anyway, I don't know if you got the American guys like Sagan or George Gamow or Isaac Asimov. That they have maybe those looks given the glaze over your eyes. I imagine many of them didn't get translated when you were younger.
Yeah, I can't. I definitely I read those later, but I think the ones that I remember was we had one by Wheeler. It was about higher dimensional space times. That was the translation. And we had a few about special relativity and hyperdrives and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah. But there were
I
no
think
German
actually, I think
popularized?
your book about Star Trek, the physics of Star Trek, I got this as a birthday gift from a boyfriend.
That makes me feel old, but that's nice. You should have held on to him, but it's okay. I'm sure it worked out.
I probably still have it, but not here.
Yeah, yeah. And
Yeah, so
anyway,
one of the things that I thought was interesting about your book is that you go on about how important it is to know what you don't know, which is also something that I try to emphasize in my book, that sometimes, we don't know is like the best thing we can say. So do you think that there's a larger message behind this, like not just for physics, but like more for how we integrate science into society, that we don't talk about this enough?
yeah, the absolutely not just that we don't talk about it enough, we don't act on it enough. In the last chapter, I have one of my favorite quotes from Jacob Bernowski, which I will read if you don't mind, because I love it so much. Dream or nightmare, we have to live our experience as it is, and we have to live it awake. We live in a world which is penetrated through and through by science, and which is both whole and real. We cannot turn it into a game simply by taking sides. And that resonated with me a lot now, because so many people are taking sides between climate change and the pandemic and other things. It's like it's this claim that the answers and everyone else is wrong. And if and a lot of what I write a lot about culture wars and other things, and I think the simple solution to that would be if more people just said, I don't know. Maybe Sabina has something to say, and it's worth listening to her when she disagrees about something. And that is what is great about science, because it's a dialectic. It really is based on people being willing to disagree and work together to try and find the true, well, at least to trying to find out what's wrong, and not having a vested interest necessarily. Of course, we're all human. We have a vested interest in our theories, but I also think when it comes to teachers and parents, too much of one of the reasons I'm not a biologist, and even though my mother wanted me to be a doctor, is when I was going to school, biology was just learning the parts of a frog and memorizing it, and I didn't know about DNA or any of those things, and it was just boring, and I was supposed to remember them and regurgitate it, and I hated that, and so I dropped biology. But I think we need, especially in this world of the internet and iPhones and fake news and misinformation and information, what we need to do in teaching is is teach by asking questions. And if more teachers, when students ask questions, said, I don't know, but let's figure out the answer. Same with parents. Why we have this vested interest when your kid asks you a question to feel you have to have the answer? That's not important. The answers, the fact, there are more facts, if you're looking up the facts, you can find it here if you want, but it's that process of discovery that's so exciting and so enjoyable. We're hardwired for it. And so I really think I don't know would be great if more teachers did it, more parents, certainly in society, and of course politicians, but that's never going to happen.
Okay. Yeah, no, I totally agree with this. I also think, though, that the way that a lot of discourse happens now with social media, and where you get people trying to communicate with each other who know very little about each other, it strongly benefits the premature formation of opinion. So people just throw out opinions like, because they feel they have to come up with something.
Yeah.
And so, for example, one problem that I have very frequently, and I'm sure you must have encountered this too, is that if I haven't put forward a strong opinion on a particular topic, people make up something.
Yeah.
And normally it's the thing that's exactly opposed to their ideology, so they can argue with me.
Yeah.
So it's kind of peculiar. But yeah, speaking about things that we don't know, I think we have to talk about time travel.
Okay.
Because otherwise people are going to be disappointed. So what do we know about time travel? Is it possible or not? What do we know? What do we don't know?
Okay, what I think, and the situation is not that different from what it was when you were young and read my book, The Physics of Star Trek. The answer, of course, is we don't know. But that's the good news. That's actually the good news, because the fact that we can't prove it's impossible is remarkable. I mean, because a world with time travel is so crazy, because, the traditional, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention the grandmother paradox or grandfather paradox, depending on how you want to do it. If I went back in time and for some reason unknown to me killed my grandmother before my mother was born, then I wouldn't be born, and then I couldn't exist. And how could I have gone back in time and killed my grandmother? So a lot of people have felt that those kind of paradoxes make a world with time travel unlikely or impossible. And Stephen Hawking originally, before he wrote the foreword for the Physics of Star Trek, had said it was impossible because we'd already been inundated by tourists from the future, was his argument. I mean, that was his popular argument. And I can't help but reminding you that I told him that they all went back to the 1960s and no one noticed. But anyway, a universe with time travel produces headaches. Yet everything we know about modern physics tells us that time travel should be possible, in a sense, that Einstein told us that space and time are really the same. They're not any real difference, and one person's space could be another person's time. And since I can go visit you in Germany and then come back to Canada, why can't I go to the future or the past and come back to where I began? And in principle, general relativity allows it. You can, any universe that you want with any time travel, which is the geometry on the left-hand side of Einstein's equations, you can then, if you can get the right kind of matter and energy on the right-hand side, you got it. So mathematically, there's no problem whatsoever. The big question is, can you produce the kind of matter and energy on the left-hand side that'll produce the universe you want? And that's the open question. It requires a kind of strange kind of energy, generally something called negative energy. In the case of a wormhole, which is a possible time machine, to hold the wormhole open and stop it from collapsing into a black hole, you need negative energy. You need some kind of strange configuration of energy. And it's still an open question. There's been some work by Alan Guth and others trying to show that it'd be hard to create that energy in the laboratory, but you can't get an ironclad proof. For the same reason, you can't get an ironclad proof about, say, the fact that the universe only goes back a finite amount of time in back. All of these things depend upon knowing how quantum mechanics and gravity work together, and that's the big open question, which is, in deference to you, I will say is a big open question in sort of a fundamental philosophical sense, and trying to understand the beginning of the universe. But it's a question that's largely irrelevant for almost everything else that we do in physics and the rest of society. So I used to hate when people said, you have a theory of everything. If you have a theory of quantum gravity, it's actually a theory of very little. Very important stuff in my mind, the beginning of the universe and maybe what happens with black holes. But in terms of understanding how oatmeal boils or anything, it's totally irrelevant.
I think I have to disagree with you on that,
Oh,
because
good.
you might be shocked, but I've recently become interested in time travel.
Oh,
It's not a joke. I'll tell you why. It's not because of the grandfather paradox, but because of another paradox which you can get with time travel, which I think is known under the name bootstrap paradox.
hmm,
So it's this idea for people who are listening. I'm sure you know it. Suppose you open a box or something and you find a notebook that tells you how to build a time machine. So you build the time machine, and by the time you've done that, your notebook is worn out. So you copy it, carry it over into a new notebook, and you send it back in time into that box which you found. Which brings up the question, where did the notebook come from?
yeah, yeah.
So, and the reason I find this interesting is that it seems that time travel breaks with the possibility of predicting the future. So, in a normal GR or something, you have a well-defined initial value problem. So, you have a deterministic time evolution. I tell you what happened in the past. You can calculate what's going to happen in the future. If you have those closed loops, like in this bootstrap paradox, you can't do that. So there seems to be some relation between the possibility of time travel in some sense, maybe not for a big notebook, but maybe on a
Yeah.
microscopic level, and indeterminism, which I'm interested in because it ties together with the question, like, why is quantum mechanics indeterministic?
Mhm.
So this is why. So I wouldn't say it's completely irrelevant for everything. Which
Well,
also neatly brings us to the next question,
uh,
namely, what does all of this have to do with quantum mechanics?
yeah, well, of course. I mean, and let me mildly disagree. My one of my dogs is whimpering because he hates quantum mechanics. But um, the quantum mechanics is indeterminate, but not indeterminate. It's a deterministic theory. You just said this. It's the same as general relativity. It's based on a second order differential equation. If you know the initial conditions of the wave function, then you can evolve the wave function with exact certainty into the future. So at its basis, quantum mechanics is a theory that's not indeterministic. When it comes to measurement, you have to worry about probabilities, but the underlying theory is just like all the other theories of physics. If you know the initial value of what's called the wave function, then it's determined for all of future history. And what you see would be different, and that's indeterministic. And just before we get to quantum mechanics, I think that you're right about time travel, that it's not just um, destroying predictivity of the future, but it's also destroying cause and effect, which is probably even more significant, right? I mean, if if you can change the effects, go by after the fact by changing the causes, then that whole notion. And let me just say, one of the solutions, which I think is probably the most realistic solution to time travel, is that you might imagine universes with closed time-like curves, as they're called, which Star Trek called causality loops, I think. I forget. But anyway, but in that case, you can have a closed loop in time, but you're doomed to repeat exactly what happened before. So there's no changes. The loop happens, but the same future happens each time. And that is one way around this. But of course, quantum mechanics suggests that each time you do an experiment, you might get a slightly different answer. And even from the same system, as long as you don't, if you're measuring the same quantity, you generally won't get a different answer. But if you change your experimental apparatus a little bit, you can get a different answer, and then go back to do the first test and find a different answer in the first place. It's one of the central features of quantum mechanics. The order in which you do things affects the results, and all of that makes quantum mechanics sound very strange. And I don't know whether you feel the same way about this. I think you do. I'm pretty sure you do. I have very little patience for people who make quantum mechanics seem so spiritually weird and talk and awesome with the many worlds interpretation and try and make, it seems to me they often make themselves, try and make themselves seem smart by talking about all this weirdness. Quantum mechanics is what it is, and it's strange and crazy, but it's only strange and crazy because we try and explain it classically. If we, of course, the interpretation of quantum mechanics is weird, but saying the interpretation of quantum mechanics is the wrong way around, as I first really appreciated from a teacher and later friend and mentor, Sidney Coleman at Harvard. We really should be talking about the interpretation of classical mechanics. The world is quantum mechanical, at least as far as we know, at a fundamental sense. The world is quantum mechanical. So why do we want to explain this quantum mechanical world in terms of this classical clue? Just like trying to explain a curved universe using Newton, you're gonna come up with weird stuff. So why do you insist on using the approximate theory to describe the real one? Quantum mechanics is weird, and I think the best example of it is this experiment. People often talk about Bell's inequality, which is a very interesting result of John Bell, who first showed that if quantum mechanics was fundamentally weird and there wasn't some hidden variables that you couldn't see, then you'd get a result. And experimentalists of later on, and recently the Nobel Prize was given for experimentalists who verified this thing. But there's a much better example that Sidney Coleman gave, not from himself, but from quoting a bunch of other people, Merman and others, that gives you a clear example of classically the only sensible answer to this experiment is a number that's +1, and quantum mechanically when you do it you get -1. You can't possibly get a bigger difference. And you know what I don't think I put in the book that I kind of wish I did was, after talking about this, Sidney Coleman said, people talk about collapse of the wave function and all these weird things. There's no collapse of the wave function. It's because you're thinking that the observer is classical and the experiment is quantum mechanical. But once you remember that the observer is governed by quantum mechanics, then you could frame things in saying that it's always going to look like the wave function's collapsing. And he quotes a story about Wittgenstein, who you may know of, a philosopher who I think was originally German, although he lived in the U.S. later, I think. And he was sitting at the street corner wondering, and someone said, "What are you thinking about?" He said, "Well, I'm wondering why people say it's natural to think that the sun goes around the earth." And people say, "Well, because it looks like the sun goes around the earth." He said, "But what would it look like if it were the other way around?" And of course, it would look exactly the same. And similarly, the world looks like the wave function collapses, as Sidney would say, but that's just because, but what would it look like if it didn't? And it turns out it would look exactly the same once you remember the observer is also quantum mechanical. So, I mean, quantum mechanics is great, but it's the most abused physical theory I can think of. It brings about the secret and all this pseudo-scientific nonsense. And as far as I'm concerned, I think physicists encourage that by making it seem weirder, or at least making it seem more spiritual than it is. So anyway, that's my tirade. Enough for something for you to have disagreed with, I hope.
Yeah, I think you shoveled a lot of problems into the tiny little word observer in your tirade, since you called it that way. I'll call it that way. So if you say that for the observer, it'll always look this way or another way, you first have to explain to me what you mean by an observer. And a typical problem with this idea that where the detector or the observer, whatever you want to talk about, is just a big bunch of quantum particles, and they also obey the Schrödinger equation, is that then the observer also splits. And then, of course, the observer is this split thing, over all the possible outcomes. So why don't we observe all the outcomes? Well, the answer to this is that you need some kind of process that kind of focuses the observer into only one of those outcomes. And so I think what you just did is you just reframed the question into, how does this happen? Like, okay, so it's no longer a collapse, but you still have to somehow find a proper definition of what you mean by an observer that doesn't spread out over all the possible outcomes, which in the many words interpretation is this issue of exactly how does the branching happens. So in my mind, this is just a reformulation of exactly the same.
Maybe. I mean, the best way is to read, actually, you can now find, for those who are, it's a little technical, but Sidney Coleman's paper, Quantum Mechanics in Your Face, the lecture he gave, was recently you can watch it on TV on YouTube, but some physicists just transcribed it and put it on the archive, and it's kind of neat. You can read it and see the technical details. But Sidney explains how you measure. This is a little technical for most people. You measure a particle to be in what's called an S wave, which is spherically symmetric, wave function. And why do you measure an electron go in some line, and he explains how, if you consider the measurement process as being a quantum object interacting with another quantum object, you can understand how the straightness projection operator will always give you a straight line, even if the original underlying thing is spherical. And so you're right. I think it is a reformation in some way, but I think it's a more accurate one because I do think most of the problems come from the illusion that we're classical, and it's that illusion that makes quantum mechanics so hard for us, because we experience the world classically, and none of us really experience the world quantum mechanically, which is why one of the reasons why Feynman said he wanted to create a quantum computer was because he hoped it would help explain quantum mechanics to him as namely solve quantum mechanics problems in a kind of intuitive way that we can't, and I don't think that's ever going to change. So I'm like you, I'm excited about quantum computers potentially, although there's a lot of hype. And I just read you saying somewhere, something I really agree with, which is, people are really worried about AI in many ways, but there's going to be a lot of excitement. We'll get to learn things. We'll get to learn things that we might not have been able to do ourselves. And what's wrong with that? I think that's great.
So maybe we'll get an AI explain quantum mechanics to us eventually.
Well, a quantum computer, I don't know whether it could explain it, but it could certainly, a quantum mechanical computer thinks quantum mechanically. And while some physicists, including Roger Penrose, unfortunately, in my opinion, have these weird ideas about how quantum mechanics might affect consciousness, which I mentioned in the consciousness chapter, I'm very skeptical. Let me just put it that way. But a quantum mechanical computer will inevitably utilize quantum mechanics definitely for coming to the answers it comes with. Now, whether in the process of being conscious, if it ever is, those quantum mechanical correlations will be broken as they are for us, we don't know.
Well, I agree with you on that. I think it's a mistake to try to explain quantum mechanics classically. It's having it the wrong way around. Quantum mechanics is the more fundamental theory, so we should try to explain the classical world from it. Though this is also a problem which we don't entirely have an answer to, which is exactly why we keep on bringing back in words like observer or measurement, because we don't know how to get them out of the Schrödinger equation. So I think I agree with you to the extent that what people call weird about quantum mechanics is the wrong thing to worry about. But I also think that there's still something weird going on, which requires investigation.
Oh yeah, and actually it's worth pointing out, as I do in the book, that there are still some pretty smart people. Gerhard de Tooft, for example, who helped create much of the physics of the modern world and won a Nobel Prize, is still, I think, convinced that quantum mechanics itself is not fundamental, that there really is some quote unquote sensible theory. And, I think most people are betting against him, but he's got a good track record. So at least, he's thinking about it. And I think it's important that people be willing to think about such questions. Yeah, there's still weird things, and there's still better explanations and maybe new explanations that are needed. The thing I think it's worth bringing up that when I was listening to you, that reminded me, is throughout the book, there are two examples at the beginning and end, time and consciousness, where some people say, in the first case, some physicists say time is an illusion, because you can think of some superspace kind of function where all of time exists and blah, blah, blah. And, it sounds, again, I think they say it to make themselves seem smart, and that's my opinion. But it doesn't matter if it's an illusion. It's an illusion. If you miss the 5:15 train to get to work, it's not illusion. It really matters. So the really interesting question is, how does that illusion arise? And the same people, some people say self is an illusion. Some philosophers and neuroscientists. Again, who the hell cares in that sense? It's not because if you get kicked in the shins or jilted by a lover, self really means something to you. And similarly, our classical world is an illusion. But saying that doesn't help at all. You want to understand how that illusion arises, and your concern about quantum mechanics is exactly that. How does the illusion of the classical world that we live in arise? And that's the interesting question. It's not the question of is it an illusion, but the real question, the really interesting question for time, quantum mechanics, and consciousness is how does that illusion arise? That's the fascinating thing.
So what do you say to people, and I get this a lot, who say that consciousness is just outside of science?
Well, I say to them the same thing as I always say. How do you know? Do you understand consciousness? Because maybe then you can explain to me how it's outside of conscious science. But if you don't understand it, then how do you know it's outside of science? Anytime anyone says science will never understand love or this or that, it's a definitive statement that suggests you know the answer. Otherwise, shut up. The point is you just don't know until you try. And certainly just because we don't understand something doesn't mean it's not understandable. It also doesn't mean that there's God or there are aliens. Every time people see an unidentified object, it's aliens. Every time there's something about nature, say animals, that seems strange, people say, aha, loophole in evolution, there's God. And the point is, lack of understanding is just lack of understanding. And the way to find out if it's understandable is to try. And until you know that there's some definitive roadblocks, you can't say that. And just because there are local roadblocks, that's the whole point of science. The beauty of science is that, yeah, you come up with roadblocks, and then you discover you're asking the wrong questions, and you go around them. And so the fact that we don't understand consciousness is not evidence that it's not understandable. I do think, however, and one of the reasons it's at the end of the book, is that it's probably one of the hardest questions that we're going to have to deal with, because we don't have any good ways of measuring, because science is determined, it progresses by experiment. You and I are both theorists, but we both know that science progresses by experiment. And so consciousness is something that's very hard to experiment in. I present in the last chapter some really fascinating experiments that show that even when you think you know why you're doing something, you're not doing. You may not know why. It's also why I say on stage, and it often makes a laugh, but it's true. I say to people, I'm not a biologist because I'm a physicist, and it's much easier. And in some ways it is easier. The mathematics, we've pushed the edge of knowledge so far that the questions are quite esoteric and involved often a lot of mathematics. But we've only been able to push so far because it's so much easier. With consciousness, it's harder. And I argue, and I'd like to see whether you agree. Feynman once said to me, he said, "He who can do nothing knows nothing." But I looked to see if that was a quote of his from anywhere else. But the quote of his that's used was on his blackboard when he died, which is, "If you can't build it, you don't understand it." And I suspect that the way, if we ever understand consciousness, it'll be by building systems that are conscious eventually. That'll be the roadmap, and it'll be a good way to do it. And as I say, there are worries, but I'm not deathly afraid. It doesn't have to be the Terminator, the future of it, of a conscious AI. It doesn't have to be Terminator. But I wonder what you think about that. Well, but it seems to me that there's a system we'll be able to experiment with. We can't experiment with human beings, and my dogs lying here, they're probably conscious. I'd like to think so anyway, but how the hell do I know?
Yeah, well, you could say that we're well on the way to build conscious beings with all this AI stuff going on now. So there are people really worried about it. At some point, they're going to become conscious, and then what? So I'm not sure if this will be the first way of learning more about consciousness, or if it'll be instead the route of measuring more about the brain. So this is the other technological direction that you see people going, right? They're making more precise measurements. They're putting electrodes into parts of the brain, wiring things around, which I think is also a path to understanding consciousness, and people have made quite some progress. So
Yeah, I think it's a path to understanding. Well, I'll interrupt you for a second. I mean, it's incredibly important and fascinating that you can measure processes as people are thinking. I think it's a path towards understanding the physical processes that might in the end result in consciousness. But I'm still a little more, after spending a lot of time thinking about it and reading for the book, I'm still more dubious that it'll help us understand how consciousness arises. It'll help us understand how the brain works. And that's important. And I recently talked with Noam Chomsky about this very subject on a thing in England remotely, and he said consciousness may just be the wrong question. I mean, you may worry about it too much. It's just like the example I like is that you and I may have even T-shirts that have Maxwell's equations written on them. At least a lot of students do. And, the four Maxwell equations tell us everything about much of the way electromagnetism works, and which is much of the universe. But when Maxwell developed them, he wrote down this theory of wheels and pulleys because he wanted to have a physical picture. Now we don't worry about it. We have a mathematical understanding, and that suffices. He argues that maybe in the end, having this physical picture of what consciousness is and how it arises may be just as misplaced as trying to have a physical picture of why electromagnetism works the way it does. I don't know, but it's an interesting idea.
Yeah, I kind of understand that. It might not, the physics of it might in the end not actually matter all that much, but we still have to get there somehow.
Yeah, and that comes from asking the right questions. And let me use this moment, and then I think we should go to some. I don't know if you feel, but it'd be fun to go to some of these questions. But I have been accused of dissing philosophy. Heaven forbid.
I think I accuse you of dissing philosophy in my book.
Yeah, or I tend to diss philosophers. That's one thing, but philosophy is very important. But the problem is how it's not a problem. The question is it of interest to scientists? Saying it may not, the philosophy of physics may not be of interest to scientists doesn't mean philosophy isn't interesting. It just means that it doesn't affect the daily work of physicists. But where philosophy is most closely tied to science are those areas of science where we don't know what the right questions are. And that's where philosophy is very, very important. And it was important in the early stages of physics, when it was natural philosophy, to think about what does it mean to be at rest and all of those kind of questions. Now physics has progressed, so the kind of questions that you ask are not generally the ones asked by philosophers. But consciousness, which is such a nascent area, is interesting. And I point this out in my book because you see contributions that are important by philosophers as well as neuroscientists. And the reason is we don't know what the good questions are yet. And philosophy is very important for that. And so that's an area where, my reverence of philosophy, if you wish, is clearly manifest because maybe the good questions are yet to be asked, and it could be a philosopher that can ask them. So anyway, I don't know.
Yep. I agree with that. I think we should maybe take some questions from other people. How are we going to do that?
Now you don't have your glasses on, I've been told. Normally I would let you read the question.
But I do, but it's the wrong ones.
Yeah, the wrong glasses. You have glasses on. So I can read through here and choose them if you want, unless you want to.
Yeah, please go ahead.
Okay. This is okay. The first question from Michael is that at least a couple of times you mentioned new information coming in as you were writing. Do you expect that such information will continue to come in at a fast pace? And again, I think both these questions are for both of us, as far as I'm concerned, unless I otherwise proved. So my answer, and then I'd be happy to hear yours, is that yes, in some areas, yes, in other areas, no. I mean, there's some areas of science that are dramatically changing quickly, and brain science is one. And I think this is one that probably Sabine and I would agree with. Do I expect new information on dark energy to come in at a fast pace? No, I think it's a deep question that's going to be hard to answer. Maybe where we might disagree is I think it's still possible we'll get new information on dark matter with an experiment, but we may not. So there are hard areas or on quantum mechanics, or let's say on the beginning of time. I don't think that's an area where where something's going to come in at a fast pace. But there are some areas of science usually driven by new tools, new experimental tools, where information is coming in at a fast pace. Sabina?
Well, I would maybe add, I think you've left out the obvious area where information is coming in, which is quantum, everything quantum technologies, quantum computing, quantum information, quantum optics, all this stuff, quantum metrology, quantum sensing. Like there's so much happening there. It's really amazing. And I'm pretty excited about it because I think in the end it'll also aid the understanding of the theory, because in this spirit of if we can build it, we can understand it. I think it's going to be really exciting in the next 1-2 decades.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I have to reinforce that. And I'm older than you, but I remember even 30 years ago, I remember talking with a colleague, Quilchik, about this, that we want to be, quantum engineering, right? Like being a quantum mechanic, not the car mechanic, but literally being a quantum mechanic, that being able to manipulate materials in a way that exploits the weirdness of quantum mechanics was then more of a dream. I mean, with superconductivity is a clear example, but now experimentalists are being able to manipulate materials to exploit the weirdness of quantum mechanics in new and fascinating ways. And that's fascinating for science. It's also going to be fascinating for technology. I think it's going to, and it's a real growth area, no doubt about it. And if you're interested in the areas of physics where there may be, which are growth areas, and there may be jobs, and that's a big area. Although I always tell students not to worry about what the jobs are. First of all, things are going to change in 10 or 15 years, and secondly, you should be driven by what you're interested in. Don't worry about whether you get a job. I don't know if you agree, but otherwise, if it's not fun for you, it's not going to be fun at all, and you won't be good at it. There's one that's for me that I'm going to take, but actually we can phrase it for you too, because you can then advertise what you're thinking about. It says, when you say, "This may be the last science book I write," it seems to imply that you may write on other topics. Can you say more? And I will say a little bit more. I mean, I don't think your book is going to be your last science book, but this may be mine. And I'm working on I think my next book is going to be a history book, a Canadian history book, in fact, something I started 50 years ago when I left college for a year and worked on it. I had access to restricted materials in our archives, and I put it in a box, which I'm looking at across the way, and told myself someday I would write it, but I was more interested in doing physics, and I may go back to that. And there are a few other books, but we shall see what comes next. I said that when I was a little disheartened about whether not just about whether I had anything to say, but whether anyone wanted to hear what I had to say. And I'm a little more enthused now, so we'll see. Anyway, but I don't know if you want to answer that at all, Sabina, or not. If you want to talk about what you're thinking about.
I can't make up my mind. So at the moment, I don't even have time to think about it. But I've always wanted to write a novel. I have the
was going to say a novel. I'm working on a novel.
About you are.
Yeah. I was too afraid to say it. Oh, that's great.
Yeah, well, who isn't? At some point, this is kind of something that I want to do for myself. So I'm going to do it anyway. I kind of feel like this, but it's kind of difficult to find the time.
Yeah, it's find the time, or it's most of them you can't publish them anyway. But yeah, I actually do have one of those actually, and amazingly, I wrote 3 or 4 chapters early on in the pandemic, and my family was actually interested in them, unlike sometimes my other writing.
We need another pandemic, and then
yeah. Oh, great. Okay. Work experience, and I think that okay. Someone talks about how they had the same experience as you, and they became an economist. Oh, how awful is that? That's an awful experience. Here's one that may be good. Do the speakers think that some of the skepticism about science today is that non-scientists now see a lot of the grunt work that happens today, such as the real-time work being done in COVID, all, which isn't perfect, and perhaps we make the same mistake in the past of projection, a seamless, flawless, clean process, and not the grunt work. And so, that, let me rephrase that. I think that's really important. It's one of the, I actually used to, in the Star Trek, I used to say the biggest fallacy in Star Trek is that you could solve a difficult problem in 2 hours. There's always like some whole huge problem. They have to invent something, and 2 hours later they've invented it. Science proceeds by a lot of dark alleys and mistakes. And one of the earliest articles I wrote about COVID was that, of course, some statements that are going to be made are not accurate because we don't have the data. We haven't had COVID. We don't have population yet to be able to say with any real accuracy what's going to happen. We can make predictions, but those predictions aren't always right. And that's the great thing about science. In some sense, it's the great thing about not knowing. But I actually do think you're right that people are so used to seeing science as a finished, beautiful process, which is part of the mistake about the way we teach it. Instead of showing as a process that's self-correcting, but a process that people think, well, if scientists said it must be true. And then when you see scientists talking about things where we don't have the data yet, which is maybe the problem, maybe they shouldn't, then confidence in science goes out the window, and that's certainly happening. I do agree that's a problem. Sabine, what do you think?
So I think I would like to question the premise of the question in the sense that I think the last few times I looked at poll results, trust in science was actually doing quite well. It actually went up through the pandemic, so that
really?
might be a country dependent thing.
Yeah.
So
Is it German? Is it a German poll?
I think it was actually in the United States, but
Wow.
so I don't know where the person came from who asked the question.
Yeah.
So in any case, you might want to look this up. But I think what we're seeing is that the people who are skeptical of science, they're much louder. So it's really difficult to get an overall impression just by looking at what you find online, what you read in the news, and so on. And this is part of the problem. But I totally agree with what you said about people are not used to seeing how the sausages are made, right?
Yeah.
And so that creates a lot of confusion where this whole idea came from, where people, did their own research with the idea that you can just look at freshly new out paper on COVID, something that you don't know anything about, and get some information out of the paper. So this isn't how it works, right? So there's a reason we normally ask experts on a particular topic. And I think this was just, it's just a lesson that people have to learn. And I'm actually happy that it happened, because it gave science communicators a lot of opportunities to stress exactly that point. And also, I think for the popular science media to learn how to deal with preprints, for example. It's like a very practical question. A lot of people had never even heard of preprints before the pandemic. And now it's something that I wouldn't say everyone knows what it is, but I think it's the knowledge about the role of a preprint and how to enjoy it, basically, is much more widely spread, and I think that's a good thing.
I'm gonna step back and say, just for those few who may not know what a preprint is, and I think there are more than you might imagine, it's at least for the physics community, and I think the rest of the community tends to communicate by not publishing a paper, but by writing a paper and sending it to colleagues. In the old days, we used to mail. Now there's a preprint server, so the whole world can see it, and it's results that are preliminary. In some sense, you're inviting the world the scientific world to comment and rebut, but it's presenting your results that they haven't yet made it into publication, so they haven't yet been subject to peer review. And even then, even if it's in publication, it doesn't mean it's right. That's a big problem that people have. They think that all published results are right too, and that's not true. So the fact that there's this ongoing, it's wonderful. The fact that we have the internet, and it allows scientists to communicate their results much more efficiently to the whole world, including the third world, which is really a significant change in science. You may be too young to remember, but maybe not. I mean, when I was starting out, and when I was at Harvard, we used to send preprints to what was happening to a selected group of maybe 50 or 100 physicists. And that meant by the time it got into print, the people who read it in print were so far behind the other scientists who we'd sent it to that they could never catch up. All the interesting responses, all the interesting new work was being done by this small group. And what's great now that there's a preprint server is anyone anywhere in the world, any young scientist can read the physics preprints and be as up to date as anyone else. I think it's a great development, and personally, a wonderful, good one. We're almost at the end of time. There are two quick questions. I think we should end, but I'll let one as a simple answer. But let's just do the first one. How far into an understanding of physics do you believe it's possible to reach without a deeper knowledge of mathematics? The answer is try. But the final answer is you can't. Ultimately, physics is described by mathematics, and so you can get an appreciation, and that's one of the reasons why we write books. And you can get physical pictures and understand a lot. So don't give up. But you can't practice physics without mathematics. So you can really work hard at getting as good an intuitive understanding as Sabine or I have, because I tend to think in pictures. So even if I've done the mathematics, I tend to later on try and think of a physical picture that helps me understand in my own mind, which is why I can write about it. But you do ultimately without mathematics, the world is described by mathematics. Sabine?
Well, I would maybe like to add that you can learn to read mathematics without having to learn how to speak it, in a sense. So, and I think this is, if I had an infinite amount of time, I would spend more time on trying to teach people how to learn equations. Sean Carroll is doing a pretty good job at this, by the way, in some of his videos.
Other stuff. Anyway, go on.
Yeah, well, so my point being that equations are very compact summaries of relations between things, and they look more intimidating than they really are. You just have to figure out, what do these symbols mean? They describe certain relations, they tell you something that acts on another thing. And I think you can, to a large extent, learn to read an equation, to figure out what it tells you, what the relations are that are encoded by it, without necessarily knowing anything about how to solve the equation or how to, write down your own theory. I think this is a much more complicated thing.
Yeah, it is. And you did remind me of something I did also during the pandemic. It was good for a bunch of things with time on my hands. And I haven't done it recently, but I did a series, I think 25 5-minute physics videos that are maybe somewhat similar to the more polished things you do on YouTube. But, I had time each day. So each day I said I'd spend 5 minutes, which ended up being 15 to 20 to 30. And I was able to talk about some things, including I used equations. And I said, let's understand these equations, because it was a finite topic, and I had enough time to do in a way that you can't normally describe, and it was a lot of fun. So I'm thinking they're on my YouTube page, my personal YouTube page, but I think we may put them elsewhere because they were a lot of fun. But yeah, you can. I think the key point is like being able to read music without being Eric Clapton. I think or appreciating music. I use music as an example because I wish I was a musician, or at least able to do it better than I can. But I certainly appreciate it, and I can even sometimes understand it a little bit, but I can never do it for some reason. And I think that doesn't stop my appreciation. Last question, because we're at time, and this is the quick answer. And I think I'll take this one if you don't mind. Well, maybe you can answer too. What known unknowns do you think will become known soon? Well, the quick answer is I don't make predictions about the future except for 2 trillion years in the future, which is both easy to do and no one will be around to check my predictions. So I don't know, but I do think there are areas where there's a lot of new observations, where there's not a lot of new tools. The quantum mechanics area is one area. I think origins of life is an area that will change a lot because we have the new tools to potentially look for life elsewhere in the universe, plus a lot of new experiments. So I'd say, I think that's one of the areas that I think we will know a lot more soon, is the nature of life in the universe. Let me give you the last word, Sabine.
Well, yeah, I would also say quantum technology will teach us a lot about the foundations of quantum mechanics. I already said this. There's just such a tremendous amount of work happening there. It would be it would be difficult to imagine that there would not be some great breakthrough coming out of it, basically.
Yeah, it's an exciting time. Science isn't over yet, and we don't know it all, and that's the whole point. And that was certainly the whole point of the British both British and American versions of the book. And I want to thank you, Sabina, so much. When I had to think of interlocutor, I know I had fun integrating you. The great thing about having you as an interlocutor is, first of all, I always enjoy our conversations, always, without fail. But secondly, you're the only one who I might worry about. And that's a good reason to, I mean, because you might ask something, even, you might trip me up in a different way and cause me to think. And that's wonderful. And that's why I like talking to you and also reading your stuff as well. But thanks again. Thanks for taking the time. And thank you all for listening. It was a lot of fun. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. Everyone, okay. You can. I don't know of a new finding that suggests any violation of general relativity. Of course, there may be, but always these things are very tentative. And the reason I'm particularly suspicious is that the new findings about black holes will come from the LIGO, but LIGO was down for 3 years and it's just turned on again. So there haven't been any really significant new results except the analysis of data from LIGO. But LIGO has been updated, the Gravitational Wave Observatory, and they're expecting to be able to see, oh, there we are. They're expecting to be able to see events every day or two instead of every week. Why am I looking down? I'm looking up. Oh, is there some wrong camera? Anyway, it's okay. Anyway, it doesn't matter. I'm seeing myself delayed, which makes it difficult. I might not want to see that, but I'm not going to watch myself. But there was another question here earlier. So are two wheels of a moving bike entangled and could not be predicted by quantum mechanics? Why not? They're not entangled. They're classical. They're not correlated quantum mechanically. That you didn't prepare them in a very particular state, and so that there's nothing quantum mechanical about bicycle wheels, and therefore, among other things, they won't go through walls. If I turn the bicycle wheel in one direction, the front wheel, the back one, is not going to turn. All of the weirdness that apparent weirdness of quantum mechanics is not going to take place for bicycle wheels. Here's another one I see. How can the multiverse not exist? Well, the whole theory could be wrong. Any ideas could be wrong. It could be that there is just one universe. We don't know. I would bet that there's not, but as I keep saying, the universe doesn't exist to make me happy. I often find that on a daily basis, in fact. But it's true. In an empty universe, how many minimum number of point particles need to be added after which it will make sense to talk about motion and time? I think one. But but maybe zero, actually. I'll even be better, zero. Because the dynamics of the universe can be governed by the dynamics of empty space. In fact, they tend to be right now. And in the far future, it'll still be a dynamic universe, but there won't be anything much around to speak of except empty space. So given the fact that space is a dynamical variable in general relativity, even an empty universe can have dynamics. The size of the universe can change. Now, you might not have a useful way of measuring it. So the fact is there won't be science because there won't be individuals around to measure it. But in terms of a physical description, you don't need any particles to talk about a dynamical universe. I didn't see Roxine, the Oscar-winning movie. Perhaps I should. Anyway, should we think of the time dimension the same way as the other three space dimensions in space-time? The answer is no, in a real sense, because you just pointed out there is a negative sign in the space-time distance formula. So the fourth time isn't a fourth dimension like the X, Y, and Z axes if you're from Europe or Canada. and the so it's you can't. It's not like you can travel in time like you could travel in space. There's a minus sign, which means the four-dimensional space-time is a little different. A rotation in a four-dimensional space-time is equivalent to a change in velocity. That's the whole point of special relativity. When I'm moving fast with respect to you, I'm doing a kind of rotation in space-time. So my space is your time and your place is my time. That's why objects are contracted in space, but kind of lengthened in time. So it's not quite the same. Minkowski space, because it was Minkowski, not Einstein, who first realized that Einstein's theory could be codified and understood as implying a four-dimensional space-time, but a very particular kind of four-dimensional space-time we call Minkowski space. It's different than just the three dimensions of space we see, which is what makes relativity so weird and non-intuitive, perhaps. How much does a baker have to understand about the baking process theory? Nothing, you say. Well, that's true and not true. If something goes wrong, then you better understand something about the baking process. And if you're just following a recipe, some people would say you're an engineer. I shouldn't say that because engineers solve problems. But that's not science. And science is trying to figure out what happens if it goes wrong, how can you fix it? And that's science. And that's engineering too, for the most part. And, how would we even know if a machine is conscious? That's a really good question. And because the Turing questions have already been shown, you can talk to ChatGPT and it sounds like it's human. So that's certainly not the case. I suspect the way we might begin to know a machine is conscious is if it asks good questions that haven't been asked before. That's not proof, but that's a long way. Consciousness is a lot more than knowing an awareness of the universe. It's also knowing what we don't know, or at least having an idea and what the questions are. And so that's a first step. But you're right. It's a problem. Will physics and biology become a single discipline? They already are merging. And disciplines. One of the reasons I originally went to last university I taught at was the president tried to convince me that that you shouldn't create 19th century. You shouldn't base a 21st century department on 19th century disciplines. You shouldn't have physics, mathematics, biology, chemistry, because the fields are different and evolve. And when I was in university, I've often told this story, so some of you may have heard it. But when I was in university during my PhD, the times I was depressed, I often thought of going into doing a joint MD PhD and making my mother happy, among other things. But I thought of biophysics, and I went to a professor at Harvard and said, I want to do biophysics. And he said, don't, because biophysics isn't of interest to biologists and it isn't of interest to physicists. That was true in 1980 or so, but it's not true today, because the central questions of biology are often answered by physics, certainly by physics tools, but now even more relevant, biological systems are becoming areas where physicists are becoming playgrounds for physicists to be asked questions in. So the meaning of those disciplines are changing and merging, and that's a good thing. I think I'm going to head out in a minute, but I won't say what I would say about the question from John Fabiani. I think there's no percentage in dissing people in public. Let's see. Okay, I think this is a good last question, maybe. Since we can never change what we observe, i.e. the laws of the universe, isn't it strange that those laws exist? Absolutely. That's one of the biggest known unknowns. Are the laws of physics universal, and is there only one kind of law, or are the laws an accident? And that's one of the biggest questions I do talk about in the book. When I went to school, and the reason I became a scientist was to figure out how the universe had to be the way it is. And now, if there's a multiverse, the answer may be that most universes aren't the way ours is, and ours may just be an accident. And that's a huge question. And Einstein put it a slightly different way, in an inappropriate way, I would say. He said, what really interests me is whether the good Lord had any choice in the creation of the universe, something to that effect. He didn't mean the good Lord, okay? He used that term all the time, and people think he was religious, but he wasn't. But his question was, the key question we ask, are the laws of physics unique? If I twiddled with one law of physics, would the whole universe come apart? And that's a great question that I wish I knew the answer to, and maybe one day we will. And with that, I think I will leave you all. Thank you for hanging on later. And it's always fun to ask questions. And I hope you enjoyed this last hour. I see one or two of you didn't. At least one of you wrote a comment saying you didn't, but I hope the rest of you did. And thanks to Corey for engineering it and making it happen. I'll see you all, and we'll try and do some more live events for the Origins podcast and the Origins project. And maybe I'll even get to see some of you live in one place or another. Take care.